Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege to invite Dr. Dayan, Jayatilleka, international political analyst, former Sri Lankan ambassador and former permanent delegate of Sri Lanka to UNESCO and the United Nations to present the next book review.
When I was a student of political science, which I still am, I suppose, we were taught that Niccolo Machiavelli made the important scientific breakthrough of removing religious and theological criteria from the study of politics. From that time, modern political science was born. And issues of right and wrong, good and bad, were relegated to ethics. But with the Second World War and Nazism and the concentration camps, the term evil returned in the study of and the discussion of political philosophy. Because nothing else would do. It was not about metaphysical evil, but you started hearing, and not only from Hannah Arendt, the term human evil. This is not a question of good or bad or right and wrong, but the horror of what Nazism deliberately perpetrated. Now, once again, in the question of Gaza and the behavior of the Zionist state, no other category will suffice but that of human evil. In that sense, our generation, like that of the 1930s and 40s, and the immediate post-war generation, has to grapple with and stand up against not just something bad or unjust, but against evil in human affairs and the behavior of states. And today we find that though the United States of America is not as bad as the Zionist state of Israel, there is the element of imitation of evil. The idea that you can remake the Middle East, which Netanyahu has tried to practice with his military aggression, is being replicated by the United States. So our fight for Palestine, for Gaza and the occupied West Bank, and against the policies of the Netanyahu administration, is a necessary part of the struggle even against what we see today, a greater power, a superpower, trying to imitate the same behavior and remake the world in the manner that it thinks fit. So this is a great moral challenge of our time. And India's Bakir Maka is one who has stood up to that challenge. When I knew Imtiaz, he's just a little older than I am, maybe a grade or two. We were opponents because we captained our respective debating teams. He at Anand College and I at St. Joseph's College. We were also on the opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. He was with the United National Party, and let me just say that my support within the Palestinian spectrum as a teenager was for Dr. George Habash, Naif Hawatmeh, and Ahmed Jibril. So that will enable you to understand where I was coming from around the same age. But throughout our lives, we have never once had any kind of acrimonious dispute. We have always been friends because I have always respected Imtiaz and he somehow has always been fond of me, despite the ideological differences. But we found ourselves on the same side of the barricades on local and global issues. He and I were on the same side of the barricades during the nationwide student uprising of 1976. And of course, on the issue of Palestine. On the issue of Palestine. Mine was in a way an inherited loyalty because when my father, Mervyn De Silva, died in 1999, Mahinda Rajapaksa, at that time a member of parliament and a minister, I believe, yes, wrote an article to the Daily News and several other newspapers. It appeared in all the newspapers. I didn't know, it didn't go through me. It suddenly appeared one morning in 1999, writing about my father, and he praised him and thanked him for mentoring him on the issue of Palestine when they were both members of the Palestinian Solidarity Committee. My father had been a member for a very long time, and Mahinda was the new head of the Palestine Solidarity Committee. So in a way, it came down the line. I was fortunate enough to be present with my father when he was the first foreign journalist to interview Abu Nidal, at that time in Baghdad. Now, on the issue of Palestine, Imtiaz was not unique, fortunately for us. But it became unique. I say he was not unique because the Sri Lankan mainstream was always pro-Palestine. To such an extent that even when the president of the time, President Jayatilleka, thought it was necessary during the war, and I think he was mistaken in this, to pay heed to his Minister of National Security, Lalita Mudali, and induct Israeli military advisors, Sri Lanka was one of the very first to recognize the PLO government in exile. We always tried to balance, even if we were doing something wrong on one side for reasons of state, we always tried to balance. And of course, balance was not the only thing we did. Sri Lanka was in the forefront on many occasions on the issue of Palestine. I was fortunate to be the ambassador who represented Sri Lanka at UNESCO in 2011 when Palestine was inducted as a new member. It was a very difficult fight. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came over and lectured to us in Paris and told us personally that the United States would cut 60% of the budget of UNESCO. And she said that it was committed by Congress resolution to do so. Now, it takes a 2/3 majority for a new state to become a member of UNESCO. And we won that battle with more than a 2/3 majority. Even France supported us. So I was happy that as the Sri Lankan permanent delegate, I was part of that battle, that historic battle in 2011. But things have changed. And Imtiaz became a unique and lone voice who still upheld the moral banner of the struggle for Palestine when things really became dark and evil. And that's what's in the book. It's not Imtiaz as part of the old movement that existed even in Parliament. He was alone. And I say this with a sense of shame. Because I grew up in one kind of Sri Lanka, and I find myself, proud as I am of having been in Paris as part of the front line of the struggle for the induction of Palestine to UNESCO, I find myself today in a Sri Lanka I don't recognize, where more than one administration has allowed a Zionist footprint in Sri Lanka to enlarge at a time that it is committing genocide in Gaza. The worst possible time. At any other time, this would have been excusable. And Sri Lanka had a very healthy tradition where if we had gone too far in the direction of relations with the Zionist entity, the successor government reversed it. Madam Bandaranaike came in 1970, representing the SLFP and the United Front Coalition, and throughout the Israeli interest section, closed it down. President Ranasinghe Premadasa, representing the United National Party at the other end of the spectrum, did exactly the same thing. And he did so despite the fact that the famous US Senator Stephen Solas met him and said, Mr. President, there would be consequences. At which point, as Bradman Veerakon has noted, Mr. Premadasa said, Congressman Solas, do you think that Sri Lanka is a country that does not know that actions have consequences? And it stood up, took his attaché case and said, this meeting is now over. And went ahead with throwing out the Israelis. But unfortunately, that is no longer the situation in Sri Lanka today. When one government makes a mistake, the other continues in that direction. At a time when even European countries don't send their ministers or deputy ministers to Israel, we do. I mean, if you have an economic reason to continue relations in some realm, for God's sake, continue it. But don't go there. Don't send the state media representatives on junkets to Israel when they are committing genocide. And I hope that this policy will be reversed, either by this or the next administration. Imtiaz stood alone. I'm not surprised, since he's the man I've known from the time we were both teenagers. That's who he was. He's much milder now. Somebody said he was known as the mighty atom. He was he was very supercharged at that time. I suppose so was I, but he has remained the same. And those speeches in this booklet, this one, read them carefully, because this was at the time of the Second Gaza War. I was Ambassador Permanent Representative in Geneva during the Gaza War of 2008-2009. And there again, we managed to pilot a resolution through against what was going on, what was being perpetrated by Israel. But this time, the work was the worst of all. And Imtiaz stood up and kept on talking about it in Parliament. Pardon me for my cynicism, but I can't help but wonder whether the real reason that he is not on the national list in Parliament is because of these speeches. Because I know how my own diplomatic career and trajectory was affected by the shadow of Zionist influence. But in this case, Imtiaz, who should have been in Parliament on the national list, was not. And when I read these texts carefully, 2023 particularly, I thought, aha, no wonder he was not sent in Parliament. No wonder. And may I say that what is happening in Sri Lanka today, the step backward, the moral and ethical collapse in Sri Lankan politics on the greatest moral issue of our time right now, the Israeli genocide. That is because there aren't people like Imtiaz, people like Mr. M.H.M. Ashraf, in parliament anymore. Governments get away with it because that opinion is no longer audible in parliament. Otherwise, the political price would have been such, nobody would have dared do it. But now there is no political price. And Imtiaz was the last man, the last who heroically kept speaking his conscience. And he's not in parliament anymore. So I will conclude by wishing that this booklet become an inspiration and an example for parliamentarians, for this generation and the ones coming up, to resume the struggle to champion the most just cause on earth today and fight against the worst human and political evil in world affairs today. Thank you, Imtiaz, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for giving me the opportunity.